Bruchim Habaim, welcome everyone to a virtual tour of ancient Egypt. I'm Nachliel Selavan, and this virtual tour is called Meet Pharaoh and Revisit the 10 Makot. I'm excited to take you into this journey into ancient Egypt and one of the best museums in the world for talking about ancient Egypt. Chazal tell us in the Mishnah, B'chol dor v'dor chayav adam lir'ot et atzmo ki'ilu hu yatsa mimitzrayim. In every generation, a person needs to see themselves as if they left Egypt. And so what I would like to do here is, through exploring Egypt's history, its geography, its archaeology, through exploring museums, to be able to broaden our appreciation of what it means to be in ancient Egypt, to live in that kind of country under the ancient Egyptian society, under Pharaoh, and from there to be able to appreciate what it's like to live in a society which has an impact on us because of what everybody around us believes. And finally, what I would like to do is, through examining some artifacts in the museum and some of Egyptian mythology, to appreciate the goal and the purpose of the 10 Makot towards Pharaoh himself, and what Pharaoh was supposed to learn from these 10 Makot, and what we Bnei Yisrael were supposed to learn, and the Egyptians are all supposed to learn while watching this process of the 10 Makot playing out. So that's what we're hopefully going to do, and the best way to begin talking about leaving Egypt is, of course, to go down to Egypt. And so, welcome to the land of Egypt, the land of the Nile. What we need to understand about ancient Egypt is that the way the Egyptians looked at the world was a little bit upside down. Upside down, did I say? Yes, indeed. Upside down. We are all looking at everything upside down, but the Egyptians were looking up towards the source of life, the source of the Nile. The Nile, which originated in Central Africa, flowed rather consistently into Egypt for thousands of years, and so Egypt's entire economy and their societal structure and their mythology, their world views, were all based on the Nile in so many different aspects, and we need to begin to appreciate that. Let's start with the geography of Egypt. Egypt has a lot of kings. Egypt was around for over 3,000 years, and Egypt was ruled most of the time by one person at a time. That is the Pharaoh. Who is the Pharaoh? Why is he so important? Well, let's begin with the very first Pharaoh. The very first Pharaoh, the legendary Pharaoh who was called Narmer, or Narmer, was able to unite both lands of Egypt. What are both lands of Egypt? Well, if you look at Egypt as we see it right now, Egypt is divided quite graphically into two parts. There is the Nile Valley, and then there is the Nile Delta. The Nile Valley is that thin, squiggly green line in which the Nile flows from south towards the north. And because of its flowing in that direction and it being topographically higher, the Egyptians called this Upper Egypt. And the part of the Nile that flows into the Mediterranean Sea in the shape of the Greek letter delta is called the Nile Delta, and the Egyptians called it Lower Egypt. Now, while that is confusing to us because we orient ourselves looking north, ancient Egyptians oriented themselves looking towards the south, whereas the rest of Mesopotamia, or the ancient Near East, oriented themselves looking towards the sunrise, towards the east. That is the first thing we need to understand. Now, this picture that I'm showing you is an introduction to Pharaoh. And this shows you on the right-hand side a GIF of Pharaoh that I got from the internet. And in the background is a little painting that I made about Pharaoh's dream. But on the left here, we have a map of Egypt, which I'm now, for you, going to flip again upside down. Now, the ancient Egyptians had crowns which were unique to each part of Egypt. This white crown is the crown of Upper Egypt. It's easy to recognize it because it's very, very tall. So, Upper Egypt. The second crown here, the red crown, is the crown of Lower Egypt. And there are several different crowns of Lower Egypt because they're shorter, because it's lower. So, for example, the Nemes crown on the right is also a crown of Lower Egypt. The legendary pharaoh Narmer, who united Upper and Lower Egypt, brought them together, and this created a double crown. This crown, the double crown of both lands of Upper and Lower Egypt. And this is the crown that symbolizes that the pharaoh is the uniter of both lands. And so very deep into Egyptian history, their concept of what the pharaoh is the uniter of both lands, the ruler of both lands, or rather of Upper and Lower Egypt and all of the land of the Nile. Now that we've seen that, it's about time to go into the museum and to visit the various pharaohs who made their way into London. Welcome to the British Museum of London. We've been here before. We're going to come here again, Bezrat Hashem. And I just want you to know that what we're doing now is a taste of the full 1-hour tour that I do called Leaving Egypt Without Leaving New York. And then it became Leaving Egypt in the 21st Century. And now I'm calling it Leaving Egypt Without Leaving Your Home, because that's kind of how it is now. So those tours are linked in the description below. You can look at my site. There's these public tours coming up and lots of other good tours. And so I hope that you subscribe to my site so that you can get notified about when the next tours are coming. Without further ado, let's jump into the museum, shall we? Welcome to the Egyptian Galleries. Now we're going to be visiting two different parts of the Egyptian Galleries in the British Museum because there's a lot of stuff here. This is the ground floor, and later on we're hopefully going to go up to the third floor. So now we're looking at a statue of Pharaoh. Now before this introduction, you would have said, oh, that's a statue of a Pharaoh. How do you know? Well, because it looks like the statue of a Pharaoh, and most of us have seen these before. But now we can tell you that he's wearing the crown of Lower Egypt. That is something new. Now I want to begin this by introducing you to the Pharaoh, to Pharaoh, and to his name. And the name of the Pharaoh is very, very important. So let's take a look at one of the most ancient lists of Pharaoh's names. And here we are, a list of the names of many kings of Egypt, the many pharaohs of Egypt, from the temple of Ramses II, Ramses the Great, who some hold is the Pharaoh of the Exodus of Yetziat Mitzrayim. Not everybody accepts that, and that's not the purpose of this tour, but I do want to mention that at least. Let's take a closer look at this list. Now look at this image. In fact, to make it easier for you, I'm going to share a slide with you so that you can see this image up close. This image has lots of little circles which are filled with hieroglyphics, and those circles actually represent the name of the king. Now, remember that idea because we're going to get back to it a little bit later when we talk about the Rosetta Stone, which is just down the hall from us. On top of each one of these circles is a crown. Some of them are the red crown of Lower Egypt, and some of them are the conical white crown of Upper Egypt. Now you're looking at that, and while it still might be gibberish, or as we say in Hebrew, Ktav Chartumim, which literally is hieroglyphics, it means a little bit more than it did before this introduction. That is the introduction. Now, these have names of many pharaohs. Not all of them survived. Some of them were actually chopped out. For example, pharaohs who were less favorable, and that's a whole story. But their name was erased if they didn't want them to be remembered. The remembering of the name of the pharaoh and the name of the pharaoh is a very, very important aspect. Here's where I'd like to share with you a nice idea. So the name of the pharaoh, what does Pharaoh actually mean? So as you see here on this chart, the name Pharaoh actually comes from the ancient Egyptian Pera'ah, which means Bait Gadol, which means great house. And this reference to the pharaoh began more or less in what's called the New Kingdom, which is roughly speaking around the time of Yetziat Mitzrayim, within 200 years of that. Before that, the pharaoh wasn't called Pharaoh, he was called Horus. That's a whole other story. Anyway, here's where I want to show you something really, really neat. When Hashem wants to reward Shifra and Pu'ah for keeping the children alive, it says as follows, Vayas lahen batim. God made for them houses. What does this mean? Well, Rashi, the famous Rashi, tells us, Batei kihuna v'leviyah u'malchut. Hashem made for them houses or dynasties of priesthood and Levites and royalty and kingdom, which means houses. Now, when we're sitting in the classroom, opening up the Chumash and looking at these psukim and reading Rashi, it sounds like a drasha. It sounds like an exegetical kind of learning. It doesn't make intuitive sense. It's a nice play on words because there's other places in Tanakh where it says batim. But what I want to posit here is that in ancient Egypt, this actually was midah keneged midah. You stood up to the great house. I will grant you a great house of your own. That is a really neat idea. Now, let's move on to the next highlight. Before we move on to talk more about pharaohs, I want to share with you something really fun because we are going to be talking about the afterlife and the Egyptian beliefs that have to do with it, and of course mummies and all of that cool stuff. So I'm going to give you a nice tip, because if you happen to be stuck in ancient Egypt inside a tomb on a tour and it's time to pray and you can't get out and there's lots of traffic because thank God travel has resumed and you're able to go to Egypt and to visit and to learn, of course don't stay overnight there if you know what I mean. So how do you know what direction you need to face if it's time to pray and you can't get out of the tomb in time? Here's a tip you need to know. What you're looking at right now is called a false door. And the reason it's called a false door is because if you try to walk through it, you're going to hit your head, but you're not going to get very far. It's not a real door, it's a false door. But the purpose of this door is to be a connection, a portal between the world of the living and the world of the dead. And this has to do with that strange way the Egyptians looked at the world. So the Egyptians looked at the sun rising in the east and setting in the west, and they said, you know what? There's the sun god Ra traveling in his sunboat across the world of the living, across the sky, and then he sets at night into the duat, into the underworld, and does his whole travel until it's time for morning when he emerges again in the east and travels across the sky. Which means that the point of contact between the world of the living and the world of the dead, the duat, the underworld, is in the west. And the false door is always facing that point of contact, the west. So if you're stuck in a tomb and it's time to pray, make sure the false door is on your left. Now let's talk about some more pharaohs. Well, first of all, we need to take our hats off before the three stooges, these three pharaohs who are wearing the Nemes crown of Lower Egypt. Here is a pharaoh who's wearing the crown of Upper Egypt. Now we're looking around and it's starting to make sense. Here is another crown of Upper Egypt. And this king over here, who has a very, very big head, this is King Amenhotep III. Now, I'm not getting into the question of which Pharaoh is the Pharaoh of Yetziat Mitzrayim, even though I will say something really nice about it very soon. But one of the opinions places it around the time of his predecessor, Amenhotep II, and you've definitely heard of his grandson, King Tut, because Tutankhamun is the grandson, probably, of Amenhotep III. His son, Amenhotep IV, is known as Akhenaten, the heretic who moved the capital to Akhetaten or El Amarna. That's a whole nother story. Now, I'd like to take you to the right-hand side of the statue to look at this very long, outstretched arm. And this is a beautiful idea that my friend Dr. Rafi Zerem told me here in the museum. If you want to think about Biyad Chazakah, about the outstretched arm of God taking us out of Egypt, you just have to look at the outstretched, powerful arm of the Pharaoh and realize, oh, we're appropriating your words against you. That is really cool. And that is something that is done a lot in Tanakh, but when you stand here and look at this outstretched arm of the mighty Pharaoh, you realize this is countering that by saying Hashem will take us out biyad chazakah. Isn't it great to be able to walk through a wall? It's just so much fun. Okay. Now, across the hall is a statue, as you see here, it says bust of Ramses. So you're in between two of the pharaohs, or at least two periods of time in which there are suggestions of who is the Pharaoh of Yetziat Mitzrayim. But what I really want to do right now is show you what's standing on my left here, and that is the Rosetta Stone. The Rosetta Stone, as you know, is the key to deciphering hieroglyphics. How exactly was that done? Remember, I showed you that list of kings' names from the temple of Ramses the Great at Abydos. That is the clue. What's going on here, and you can sort of see it on the plaque. Let's zoom in. It says there, it reads here, the key to Egyptian hieroglyphics. You see that there's a circle here that contains within it hieroglyphics. That circle is called in French cartouche, which means cartridge, something that you fill things inside it. And what the famous scholar Champollion noticed is that that particular shape shows up here on top in the hieroglyphics the same amount of times as the name King Ptolemy V shows up here in the Greek, which he knew how to read. And so he had a hunch that perhaps this is the name of the king. Now, long story short, he was able to figure out through this how to crack the code for reading hieroglyphics 150 years ago. And it all has to do with the name of the king. And now I'm going to share with you just a nice idea which has to do with the name of the king. And this is an idea which I heard from Dr. Yael Ziegler, so I want to thank you very much for sharing that idea with me. And that idea is as follows. Who is the Pharaoh of the Exodus? The name Pharaoh, as we saw, is a very generic term. It simply means great house, Bayit Gadol, sort of like saying the White House or the Kremlin. It doesn't refer to the king himself. We know of many pharaohs, even in Tanakh, who are called, for example, Paro Chofra, Paro Necho, Paro Sheshak. So when Torah leaves out his name and is just putting it as Paro, perhaps it's actually making a point. And the point has to do with names. And here is where I want to share with you. When Hashem meets Moshe at the burning bush, at the sneh, he tells him, Zeh Shmi le'olam, v'zeh zichri ledor v'dor. This is my name. It's all about Hashem's name. When Hashem sends Moshe to talk to Paro, he says to him that the reason that I'm letting Paro endure all of these makot is leman saper shmi b'chol haaretz, is so that everybody will know God's name. And there are several different examples of this concept of it all being about God's name in contrast with the Pharaoh's name. The pharaohs built all these incredible monuments to eternalize their name, and the most poetic justice is that we never know who the pharaoh was. It's just Pharaoh, generic Pharaoh. His name is hidden. So I want to thank Yael Ziegler for that insight. It's a beautiful insight. And on that note, we're going to move on. There is our statue of Ramses the Great, one of the greatest pharaohs of ancient Egypt from one of their greatest periods of time. Let's move up close. We are standing right below the statue of Ramses the Great, one of the greatest kings of Egypt. He ruled for 67 years, and he was a pretty tall guy, actually. He found his mummy. It's in Cairo. Fun fact. One more thing I want to show you here as we walk right through this stone slab is this ram. Now, you're looking at a ram. Ringing any bells? Well, Korban Pesach. And what we hear about Korban Pesach is that Bnei Israel were worried that perhaps the Egyptians would be angry that we would take their god and tie it to the bedpost and then slaughter their god for making a korban, for making the offering. But what we know from Egypt is that they actually had the ram god, which represents Amun-Ra, and you're looking at a statue of him right here. So some of the stuff you hear about and then you go to the museum or you go to Egypt and you see it really brings it to life. So that was our first part. But you notice how all around us are these heavy stone coffins in which all these mummies were found. Where are the mummies? Well, beam me up, Scotty. We are going to the third floor to where all the mummies are. And here we are. We are on the third floor and we are surrounded by mummies. Let's look around a little bit. Mummies, caskets covered in gold. Wow. And lots of little jars. Let's not wake the dead. We don't want to sound the alarm, but we are surrounded by mummies. We're looking at many informative plaques. Go to the museum, read them, look at them, or travel here on Google Street View. You can actually read them. They show you the embalming process. There's all of the mourning process, and you actually have real mummies and bodies here. So do your homework before you come in, especially Kohanim. Some say you can, some say you can't, but I just want to encourage you to look it up yourself. And look at these little models that were actually buried with the dead in their tombs. Some of these little wooden painted models are 4,000 years old, and they survived in these unique, hot, dry conditions in the tombs of Egypt. That is really, really cool. If you look there to the left, you'll notice that there actually are some skulls right there, some bones right there. That's all I'm going to say about that. We're going to get away from there. Another room full of mummies, but now we're going to actually see some really, really neat stuff. So I want to show you something about mummies. So first of all, the Egyptian buried with their dead a lot of the things that these Egyptians used when they were alive. And the reason that they did that is to make sure that in the afterlife, the dead would be provided with all the good things that they enjoyed in this world. So it was either the actual item, or there were paintings on the wall that had magical properties, magical powers to be able to act out as if they are the thing itself. So pictures of cows and servants and fishing and all that cool stuff. Now, one of the things that the Egyptians wanted to make sure would happen is that the soul of the deceased would actually know what to do in the afterlife in order to keep on going and preserve itself forever. So for that, there were a series of instructions we're about to see. Ooh, look at that. Okay, here we are. So we are looking at a bunch of papyri, which are Egyptian paper made from reeds. And you see that on the placard on the side, it says magic for the dead, funerary texts. Now we're going to look up close at several of these texts. And here is where we're going to talk about the 10 Makot and about Pharaoh. So bear with me because we're going to talk a little bit about Egyptian mythology and why that is actually important. So these texts are texts which will be buried with the dead. They're called funerary texts, but originally they were pyramid texts. In other words, inside the pyramids, they're painted on the walls. But not everybody's able to afford a pyramid, and not everybody's able to afford a wall painting in their tomb. So what would they have instead? They'd have those same texts written down on papyrus, buried with the dead. What are these texts? Let's take a closer look at a couple of them. So the picture you're looking at right now is part of the Book of the Dead. I call it the Guide for the Perplexed in the Afterlife, perhaps. And it shows you a particular part of this ceremony which you need to go through in order to make your way into the underworld, the world ruled by the Egyptian god of the underworld named Osiris, who is sitting here nicely on the right-hand side with his crown, and he's all wrapped up and mummified because he's the lord of the underworld of the Duat. Now, this is a ceremony called the weighing of the heart, which is part of the judgment of Osiris. And the weighing of the heart really opens up a lens for appreciating what is the purpose of the 10 Makot. So I want to give this a bit of an introduction. When Hashem sets out on the final Makat Bechorot, Hashem says, Uvechol Elohei Mitzrayim e'eseh shvatim ani Hashem. I'm going to mete out punishment or judgment to all of the gods of Egypt. Now ask yourself, what on earth is the purpose of God giving any attention to the gods of Egypt if they are all mythological make-believe figures? The answer to that is that what we call religion and scholars call mythology for the Egyptians, and for any culture in the ancient world really, was an understanding of the world. You can't just take that away from people. You have to take them through a process of recognition, of realization that the way they're looking at the world is incorrect. And so the 10 Makot, I want to call it a 10-step therapy session, which was there primarily for all of Egypt to look at and all of us to observe Egypt learning from. But it is, of course, for Pharaoh himself, because Pharaoh is metaphorically at the top of the pyramid of the society. He is the ruler of both lands, and so he really needs to get the message, but everyone needs to get the message. So it's Leman Saper Shmi B'chol Haaretz. It's so that the whole world will know Hashem's name. And so this is setting an example. So the image that we're looking at right now shows us that there is a judgment, and I want to just parse this apart and just show a few of these mythological characters, and then we're going to get to Pharaoh. So first of all, the fact of the judgment itself. What is going on in the Book of the Dead is that the heart of the deceased, in this case it's a woman, you see her picture on the left, is being weighed against the feather of justice, the feather of Ma'at. We're going to talk about that very soon. And the Egyptian god who is weighing the scale is Anubis, the jackal god, who is responsible for that dangerous transition from the world of the living to the world of the dead. And in fact, the Egyptian priests who would mummify the body would wear a mask of Anubis while embalming the body in order to enact Anubis's help in the transition from the world of the living to the world of the dead. Now, this is a really fun part, and here I'm going to take you to a spooky picture I found on the internet. Lots of cool fan art about this. And this is in Makat Bechorot, the dead of the firstborn. Hashem says a very curious thing, which is Ulechol bnei Israel lo yecheratz kelev leshono. Not a dog shall snarl at bnei Israel throughout Makat Bechorot. And the reason for that is the stranger thing is Leman ted'un asher yafle Hashem ben Mitzrayim uven Yisrael. And so that everybody will know that Hashem is the one who differentiates between who shall live and who shall die, between the Egyptians and the Israelites and Bnei Israel. Now, here is the beautiful point, which again, I'm saying thank you to Dr. Yael Ziegler for pointing this out to me, is that the Egyptian belief is that the dogs, which is really the power of nature that Anubis represents, are very sensitive to death. Wild dogs, jackals would hang out around cemeteries on the outskirts of the city. And so when there's death rampant, you'd expect to hear dogs howling and snarling everywhere. And yet all you hear is crickets. The fact that there is complete silence during the time of Makat Bechorot is miraculous. It's eerily miraculous and unnatural. And this is going to drive the point home that it is not Anubis, but it is God who is in charge of the transition from life to death. This is one of many messages that are carried out and meted out gradually throughout the 10 Makot. Now let's talk about our hero, or rather our villain, Paro. So looking back at this image, you're looking that on the scales, right, is a feather, or rather an ostrich's feather. Now that feather represents the goddess Ma'at. Ma'at is the goddess of cosmic balance, order, justice, and harmony. One of the roles of the Pharaoh is to maintain Ma'at, to maintain cosmic order, and maintaining the flow of the Nile and the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt. Now, for thousands of years, this is what the pharaohs believed, and because the Nile was rather consistent, they could count on it. And so, what we go back to the 10-step therapy session, the 10 Makot, we're trying to show Paro and all of Mitzrayim that he doesn't control the Nile, and he doesn't control the world. And you wean him step by step. Dam, Tzfardea, you talk about the Nile and the life within it. Kinim, the land and the earth and the creepy crawlers within it. Arov, Dever, Shchin, you're talking about animals and then boils and skin disease. And then you're talking about human beings and you're talking about the skies and the heaven. And finally you get to the power of life itself. And at a certain point, Paro recognizes that he's been living in a bubble by the nightmare that has been created by his stubbornness. And at this point, this is really where the cutoff between Parashat Va'era and Parashat Bo happens, where Paro comes and finds Moshe and Aaron, and he says, Chatati hapam, Hashem hatzadik, ve'ani ve'ami hareshaim. Imagine what it took for Paro to be able to recognize that truth, that he is wicked and evil, as opposed to this being a battle of will. And one final point I'd like to mention is that what happens if your heart is too heavy against the feather of Ma'at, against the balance of justice? It is eaten up by this monster you're looking at. And this monster is a mixture, a conglomerate, or an arov, if you will, of the three biggest human-killing animals in Egypt: the crocodile, the hippopotamus, and the lion, or another feline predator. Rabbi Dr. Rafi Zeram showed me that you could even read Rashi to explain that the arov is a mixture of wild animals, or a wild animal that's a mixture of many. Who knows? But this is the Egyptian boogie monster, and I think that it's a cool interpretation. But anyway, the point that I'm trying to make here is, how many times have we heard about Paro and his servant's heart being heavy? Ki ani ichbadeti et libo ve'et lev avadav, ki kaved lev Paro, vayachbed Paro et libo. Now the beautiful thing here is that in ancient Egypt, heaviness of heart means evil, means wicked, and it means you're doomed. So the language of heaviness of heart is found in the Book of the Dead and in the mythology, and it's just a cool way to appreciate how understanding ancient Egypt really brings to life many of these psukim. Our final point on this tour is going to be the Great Pyramids of Giza. Let's go. 3, 2, 1. And here we are, the ancient pyramids of Giza. Why are we talking about the pyramids? Well, because here is where I want to share with you a story that the archaeologist Meir Bendov told the son of a very important American dignitary. I'm going to leave the full story for the tour if you want to join me, but the basic idea of this story is this. There's a kid who asked Meir Ben-Dov, what's the difference between Herod the Great, or the king of the Jews for our purpose, and the pharaohs of Egypt? And Ben-Dov, the archaeologist who excavated Jerusalem after 1967, who excavated Masada, right? He said to him as follows: the king of Egypt used all of the resources of the country to make a temple, to make a pyramid to serve him in the afterlife. Look at this pyramid. It's incredibly impressive. We are standing right before the great pyramids of Giza, the pyramids of Khufu of the 4th dynasty. These pyramids were built about 1,000 years before we ever came into Egypt. These pyramids are all there, each one of them, to serve one pharaoh, one person. And it took the resources of the country to make it, to make this magnificent wonder of the ancient world. And this is what Meir Ben-Dov was saying. The Egyptian king used the resources of the country to serve one person in the afterlife, to serve him. Whereas the king of the Jews used his resources to make a temple in Jerusalem to allow all of the world and to allow the Jewish people to come and see the glory of God and to serve the God of Israel in the temple in Jerusalem. That story had a tremendous impact, but the beauty here is that the Pharaoh is literally and metaphorically at the head of the pyramid. And what we have seen here through understanding ancient Egypt, through the archaeology, the history, the mythology, the context, is that Pharaoh really needed to be taught slowly and gradually that he doesn't run the world. And the Egyptians needed to learn that too. And we gradually learn as well that Pharaoh cannot have that much power over us. He's not as powerful as he thinks he is, and that is et asher italalti b'Mitzrayim. That's Hashem making a mockery of Egypt by showing him that it's all a game, but he does need to make that point so that he can think for himself and eventually be free. And so we are seeing that there's an entire society who is entrenched in these beliefs and ideas which don't let them be free, and the purpose of the 10 Makot, which took an entire year, is to get them to open their eyes and to be able to look at the world in a different way. And I hope that we've been able to do that a little bit here through this virtual tour, to open our eyes and to be free and to be able to leave the bondage of Egypt. It doesn't matter if it's physical or conceptual, but to be able to leave Egypt and to really be free this year. Thank you so much for watching, and Chag Kasher V'Sameach.